With what excuses the doctor and locksmith were got rid of on that first morning was something Gregor never learned because, as he was not able to make himself understood, it didn't occur to anyone, not even his sister, that he could understand others. And so, when his sister was in his room, he had to content himself with hearing her occasional sighs and appeals to various saints. Only later, once she had got adjusted to everything a little, of course there could be no question of becoming fully used to it, Gregor sometimes caught a well-intentioned remark, or one that was capable of being interpreted as such. "He had a good appetite today," she said, when Gregor had dealt with his food in determined fashion, whereas in the opposite case, which came to be the rule, she would sometimes say almost sorrowfully, "Oh, it's hardly been touched today." While Gregor was not given any news directly, he was sometimes able to glean developments from the adjoining rooms, and whenever he heard anyone speaking, he would rush to the door in question and press his whole body against it. Especially in the early days, there was no conversation that did not somehow, in some oblique way, deal with him. For 2 days, at each meal, there were debates as to how one ought to behave, and in between meals the same subject was also discussed, because there were always at least 2 members of the household at home, probably as no one wanted to be alone at home, and couldn't, in any case, wholly leave it. On the very first day the cook had begged on her knees, it was unclear what and how much she knew about what had happened, to be let go right away, and when she took her leave a quarter of an hour later, she said thank you for her dismissal, as if it was the greatest kindness she had experienced here, and without anyone demanding it of her, gave the most solemn oath never to betray the least thing to anyone. Now his sister had to do the cooking in harness with her mother. Admittedly, it didn't create much extra work for her, because no one ate anything. Gregor kept hearing them vainly exhorting one another to eat, and receiving no reply other than, "Thank you, I've enough," or words to that effect. Perhaps they didn't drink anything either. Often his sister asked his father whether he would like a beer, and offered to fetch it herself, and when her father made no reply, she said, to get over his hesitation, that she could equally well send the janitor woman out for it, but in the end his father said aloud, "No," and there was an end of the matter. Already in the course of that first day, his father set out the fortunes and prospects of the family to his mother and sister. From time to time he got up from the table and produced some certificate or savings book from his little home safe, which he had managed to rescue from the collapse of his business 5 years ago. One could hear him opening the complicated lock and shutting it again after taking out the desired item. These explanations from his father constituted the first good news that had reached Gregor's ears since his incarceration. He had been of the view that the winding up of the business had left his father with nothing. At any rate, his father had never said anything to the contrary, and Gregor hadn't questioned him either. At the time, Gregor had bent all his endeavors to helping the family to get over the commercial catastrophe, which had plunged them all into complete despair as quickly as possible. And so he had begun working with an especial zeal, and almost overnight had moved from being a little junior clerk to a traveling salesman, who of course had earning power of an entirely different order, and whose successes, in the form of percentages, were instantly turned into money, which could be laid out on the table of the surprised and delighted family. They had been good times, and they had never returned, at least not in that magnificence, even though Gregor went on to earn so much money that he was able to bear, and indeed bore, the expenses of the whole family. They had just become used to it, both the family and Gregor. They gratefully took receipt of his money, which he willingly handed over, but there was no longer any particular warmth about it. Only his sister had remained close to Gregor, and it was his secret project to send her, who unlike himself loved music and played the violin with great feeling, to the conservatory next year, without regard to the great expense that was surely involved and that needed to be earned, most probably in some other fashion. In the course of Gregor's brief stays in the city, the conservatory often came up in conversations with his sister, but always as a beautiful dream, not conceivably to be realized, and their parents disliked even such innocent references. But Gregor thought about it quite purposefully, and meant to make a formal announcement about it at Christmas. Such, in his present predicament, perfectly useless thoughts crowded his head while he stuck to the door in an upright position, listening. Sometimes from a general fatigue he was unable to listen, and carelessly let his head drop against the door before holding it upright again, because even the little noise he had made had been heard next door and had caused them all to fall silent. "Wonder what he's doing now," said his father after a while, evidently turning towards the door, and only then was the interrupted conversation gradually resumed. Because his father tended to repeat himself in his statements, partly because he had long disregarded these matters, and partly because Gregor's mother often didn't understand when they were first put to her, Gregor now had plenty of occasion to hear that, in spite of the calamity, an admittedly small nest egg had survived from the old days, and had grown a little over the intervening years through the compounding interest. In addition to this, the money that Gregor had brought home every month, he kept back no more than a couple of guilder for himself, had not been used up completely, and had accrued to another small lump sum. Behind his door, Gregor nodded enthusiastically, delighted by this unexpected caution and prudence. The surplus funds might have been used to pay down his father's debt to the director, thereby bringing closer the day when he might quit this job, but now it seemed to him better done the way his father had done it. Of course, the money was nowhere near enough for the family to live off the interest, say. It might be enough to feed them all for a year or two, at most, but no more. Really, it was a sum that mustn't be touched. It ought to be set aside for an emergency. Money for day-to-day living expenses needed to be earned. His father was a healthy, but now elderly man, who hadn't worked for 5 years now, and who surely shouldn't expect too much of himself. In those 5 years, which were the first holidays of a strenuous and broadly unsuccessful life, he had put on a lot of fat, and had slowed down considerably. And was his old mother to go out and earn money, who suffered from asthma, to whom merely going from one end of the flat to the other was a strain, and who spent every other day on the sofa struggling for breath in front of the open window? Or was his sister to make money, still a child with her 17 years, and who so deserved to be left in the manner of her life heretofore, which had consisted of wearing pretty frocks, sleeping in late, helping out at the pub, taking part in a few modest celebrations, and above all, playing the violin? Whenever the conversation turned to the necessity of earning money, Gregor would let go of the door and throw himself onto the cool leather sofa beside it, because he was burning with sorrow and shame. Often he would lie there all night, not sleeping a wink, and just scraping against the leather for hours. Nor did he shun the great effort of pushing a chair over to the window, creeping up to the windowsill, and propped against the armchair, leaning in the window, clearly in some vague recollection of the liberation he had once used to feel, gazing out of the window. For it was true to say that with each passing day, his view of distant things grew fuzzier. The hospital across the road, whose ubiquitous aspect he had once cursed, he now no longer even saw, and if he hadn't known for a fact that he lived in the leafy, but perfectly urban, Charlottenstrasse, he might have thought that his window gave onto a wasteland, where grey sky merged indistinguishably with grey earth. His alert sister needed only to spot that the armchair had been moved across to the window once or twice before she took to pushing the chair over there herself after tidying Gregor's room, and even leaving the inner window ajar. Had Gregor been able to speak to his sister, and to thank her for everything she had to do for him, he would have found it a little easier to submit to her ministrations, but, as it was, he suffered from them. His sister, for her part, clearly sought to blur the embarrassment of the whole thing, and the more time passed, the better able she was able to do so. But Gregor was also able to see through everything more acutely. Even her entry was terrible for him. No sooner had she stepped into his room than, without even troubling to shut the door behind her, however much care she usually took to save anyone passing the sight of Gregor's room, she darted over to the window and flung it open with febrile hands, almost as if she were suffocating, and then, quite regardless of how cold it might be outside, she stood by the window for a while, taking deep breaths. She subjected Gregor to her scurrying and her din twice daily. For the duration of her presence, he trembled under the sofa, even though he knew full well that she would have only been too glad to spare him the awkwardness, had it been possible for her to remain in the same room as her brother, with the window closed.